I'm Agent Scott,
And I'm Cam the Provocateur.
and we're from the Spyhards movie podcast.
That's right. And you are listening to Pods Like Us, the podcast that has a license to thrill.
Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv, and this time I am joined by Agent Scott Hardy and Cam Smith, the Provocateur from Spyhards. Thanks for talking to me, guys. Hope you're okay.
Yeah, we're doing well. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, hey Marv, thanks for having us, buddy.
That's fine, no problem. It's great to speak to you. So, how were you introduced to podcasting in the first place, Cam?
Oh boy. You're sending me way back. Probably around the mid 2000s. I started listening, I think, to Kevin Smith's Smodcast podcast.
Yeah.
That was when I was in university, and so I suddenly was like, "What is a podcast?" And I kind of learned through Kevin Smith, and then jumped off into some other shows like the Slash Filmcast, and it was kind of in that point in time where it was like no one really kind of knew how these things worked, but I thought, hey, why don't I try doing something like this? And so I got together with a friend and we launched a movie podcast called the Epicast. And that was probably around 2008, because I know we did movies like Taken. I know we did Inglourious Bastards. It was a bunch of things around that 2008 to 2010 period. And it was all just like feeling around in the dark, going through very convoluted measures in terms of how to record these episodes, upload them. It was all a nightmare, but we did it for about 2 years, very irregularly. So that kind of taught me all the hard to learn lessons that in the years since have been completely ironed out by technology. But yeah, I was, I guess, early in. And at that point, you actually got huge downloads for any show you did because there was so few podcasts out there.
Completely different to nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally. Totally. It was a really crazy time to be doing it just because, nowadays, if you say I have a podcast, everyone goes, yeah, so do I. So does my cousin. So does my neighbor. Back then it was like, I'm sorry, a what? Can you please explain to me what you're doing? So
Even some of my family members have said to me when I've been advertising my shows, they said, what's a podcast? Which is strange to me because they've been going for, must be 15, 16 years, I suppose now.
Mm-hmm.
So what about yourself, Scott? How were you introduced to podcast?
What's a podcast?
Scott thought this was AM radio.
Good evening, this is Talk Radio.
I think I'd be great at talk radio, but that's another universe, I think. I couldn't give you a date like Cam. I used to be a big listener of wrestling podcasts.
Yep.
And just sort of regular news updates, daily podcasts, things like that. Wade Keller was him and his team was one of the people who actually originated kind of the idea. One of the first major podcasts was Wade Keller, PWT. And I sort of listened to them for a long time. And then I found shows like No Such Thing as a Fish, Brett Everett's Movies to Watch Before You Die, I think it was called. I listened to that for a while. And that was it, really. Didn't really expand out of that for a long time. And then I met Cam.
And everything changed there.
It did, because I had done a Star Trek podcast that I'd launched in 2014 called Subspace Transmissions for many years. And I'd known Scott since, I guess, 2013, Scott?
I thought it was like 2011.
No, it would have been, I think, 2013, because my first... Well, we'll get to that story in a second, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 2013. And so Scott had kind of been a witness to the podcasting journey I'd been on over the years doing the Star Trek one. It's ups and it's crippling downs.
Yeah, tell me about it, buddy.
So go on then. How did you both meet each other, and how did the show get started?
Well, we were both in the men's toilet.
Okay. And you saw a message left on one of the doors.
for a good podcast called Cam Smith.
I was recording Scott at the time.
We basically met in an entirely different country than either of us live.
Wow.
So we're both Star Trek fans as well as spy movie fans, and we met at the Star Trek Las Vegas convention, which is the biggest Star Trek convention in the world. It runs annually, although it didn't run these last years because of COVID, of course.
Yep.
But yeah, and we met through mutual friends. I think that's fair to say, Cam.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that was sort of the genesis, really. We sort of hung out for that first convention. I went there with an ex-girlfriend at the time, so Cam sort of witnessed the destruction of that relationship, which also happened on that holiday. And I sort of been going back ever since every year, and the friendship sort of built from there.
Yeah, and my co-host on Subspace Transmissions goes with me. I guess starting in 2014, he started going to the convention. And so Scott became, again, a friend of him. And so we would have Scott on the Star Trek podcast every time we could. Basically, we would record episodes when we were in Vegas every year. Scott would also send in voicemails to our podcast. And so, yeah, at a certain point, it just made sense to us to, branch off into doing something else.
That's cool. So when did you first think about actually doing Spyhards, and how long did it take you to eventually get the show started?
Well, us, like many podcasts at the moment, are what I would call a lockdown podcast.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that it ends when lockdown's lifted. I mean, Marv, you know quite well that we're still in a lockdown here in the UK. Cam is not so much in lockdown in Vancouver, but I think the discussion actually started around the first lockdown in the UK, so around about maybe June time last year.
Okay.
But to take it back a little bit, sort of a genesis of what led into that, a couple of years ago, bought the Bond movie box set. And I had seen most of them growing up, but I decided to watch them all in a row. And I knew Cam was a Bond fan.
Yeah.
And so I kind of chronicled my journey through the films, like texting him throughout. And that kind of led us down the path of talking about doing some sort of podcast when we started discussing the idea. But it took us a little while to get to the point of spy movies.
Okay.
Yeah, because originally, I mean, my relationship with Bond goes way back to when I'm probably about, 9 or 10 years old, and I was always obsessed with that franchise. And yeah, I remember Scott and I kicking around ideas, and the natural inclination was to do, a James Bond podcast. But there's so many out there, and like the James Bonding podcast is one I listened to religiously. It was fantastic, and I just thought, like, boy, it's tough to deliver something better than what has already existed. And also, there's only 25 Bond films. There's a couple unofficial, but 25 official. So, like, is there a lot of fodder to really dive into at this point? Are we just going to do 25 episodes and then be like, okay, well, I guess we'll do episode by episode reviews of James Bond Jr., the animated show? Like, what do we do? It kind of gets a little bit thin. And so going wider allowed us to tackle things like Mission Impossible, which we love, franchises like the Jason Bourne films, and just open up to movies we've never seen. Because, I mean, I'm a big Hitchcock fan. I like a lot of classic film, but there's tons of old spy movies that, I've been aware of, but I never actually watched.
So have you come across any films or thought about any films that you discussed on your previous film podcast, Cam?
No, I don't think there has been a crossover yet. We actually, I'm not going to spoil anything, but Scott and I were actually just plotting out our next 8 episodes that we'll be recording. And there will be a crossover officially with one of those. But to date, I don't think so. No. I think we've actually been pretty good at picking things that I haven't explored a lot in that old movie podcast, although I should note, I guess this slips my mind, but I also do an Arnold Schwarzenegger film podcast with another friend. It's been on hold because of the pandemic. We prefer to record those in person together.
Yeah.
So it's been on hold for almost a year now. But we actually did do True Lies on the on Spyhards, and I have done True Lies on that podcast, Arnie-geddon. So there's two very different reviews, I think, of True Lies on either podcast.
And I listened to that one, the Arnie-geddon version, just to take notes of what not to do.
Obviously, yeah. I mean, it was basically just 90 minutes of "aye" sort of sounds.
Yeah, that sounds like Spyhards.
Dear. Tom Arnold, why am I always in the van?
He retweeted the episode when we put that out a few months back, and like tweeted a GIF at us to all of his followers as well. That was quite nice of Tom. Yeah, that definitely helped out.
That is so cool because I think, I mean, I've not listened to that episode yet, but I think he's an incredibly important part to that film.
Oh yeah, and quite a controversial casting choice at the time. I mean, James Cameron had to go to the mat to get him hired onto that film, and no one really believed that was a good idea. I remember at the time being like, really? That's who you're putting in a Schwarzenegger film? But really delivered, for sure.
Absolutely. It added to the... I mean, it's a really good comic film anyway in those places. I mean, Arnold pulls off comedy really well, surprisingly, considering what he was doing back then. And Tom Arnold just adds to that. But then again, so does Bill Paxton as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I love Bill Paxton to death. I mourn the fact that he left us so soon because that guy had so many years of great character work. I mean, I would love to see an 80-year-old Bill Paxton, because he just would have been one of those great character actors we would have seen right probably till the end of his days.
Absolutely. So, how would you describe your show to people who haven't heard it?
Gibberish. I suppose the best way to put it is we cover the best and worst of spy movies to figure out if they make this list that we've created, or we're trying to create, that we call the knock list. But basically, we'll pick movies from all over, from when spy movies been created. So back at the earliest is the 30s we've got at the moment. And just sort of put it through this filtration process if we think it's good enough to make this list.
Yeah, and we call the list the knock list. I'm sure people remember the term the knock list from the first Mission Impossible film. We use it as the need to see official classics of the Spyhards canon. That's the acronym we've gone for. And the idea is we're assembling the ultimate list, the pantheon of great spy films. If someone says, I need to know the greatest spy films of all time, stat, you would hand them this list and they would say, perfect. These look like the best candidates possible. And so we go through each movie, and we are, obviously doing Hitchcock stuff, James Bond, a lot of the things people look to when they think great spy films, but we're also digging for hidden gems as well, movies that maybe don't jump immediately to the front of your memory when you're thinking of great spy films.
Absolutely. So you will be going to like Matt Helm, etc., and Our Man Flint.
100% yes. Our Man Flint is coming up real soon. We'll probably space out the Matt Helms just because they are somewhat similar in tone to like a Flint franchise, but Matt Helm is 100% on the list.
Okay, so how do you choose the films then? I mean, they're not obvious spy films. You'll pick films that have elements, even though they're not technically seen by a lot of people as spy films. Like Men in Black, for instance, I suppose.
Yeah, it was an interesting sort of way of looking at it, because initially we sort of found as many spy films as we could, and we put that on a spreadsheet that we have. But then we thought, well, there's lots of other things that are sort of spy adjacent, which is almost like a term we use a lot. I think we've probably coined it, spy adjacent. And one of the things we thought about is, well, what are big franchises that are spy adjacent? And we eventually got to Men in Black because they do kind of go undercover. They are a secret service of some sort. that work for the American military or American government, and it just seemed like an interesting well to mine. And also, it can get quite dry if you're just talking about John le Carré adaptations every week.
Yeah, and there's so many films now. A lot of the franchises people love. You said Men in Black, but I don't know how much they love Men in Black at this point. But think of like John Wick, for example. It's about a secret society. It's about trained assassins. It's the sorts of things you see in spy movies. You can even look at the last couple you can also look at the last couple Fast and Furious movies where they become like these international agents that run missions, for a covert organization. It's these sorts of franchises as well that allow us to look at not necessarily what you think of as the sharply defined spy movie, but more as the evolution of what spy movies can be for a popular market.
And the other thing as well, quite honestly, is it just adds longevity to it. If you include these other franchises that are adjacent, as I say, it just gives us more things to work with. Otherwise, after a year, we would be speaking about the most obscure films you've never heard of.
And people were always like, well, why don't you just do all the Bonds and all the Mission Impossibles? And we're like, well, what's left in terms of what people, like in terms of popularity? You want to space out the really cool stuff and introduce other, listeners to movies that maybe not be on their radar. And maybe some of those really have a lot of value.
Absolutely. I mean, with that sort of scope, you could possibly include something along the lines of In the Line of Fire, because you've got the Secret Service agents.
Yep. So if someone can make a good enough argument to us, and we've had this on like Instagram or on Twitter in the past, if you can make a good enough argument about its inclusion, we will discuss it and cover it. There's a few we've added to our master spreadsheet that have been suggested to us that we didn't think were quite right, but then upon review, we've added it to the list to cover.
I mean, Condor Man, for instance, which you've done, that's the most recent one to this recording that you've done. That's got elements of secret agency work to it, but it's also, I don't know, is it a tongue-in-cheek superhero film or something as well?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It definitely is. But, if you think about just Condor Man as a story, he's a comic book writer, this character, Condor Man. Yeah. He's a comic book writer, but he does a job for his friend who works for the CIA to deliver a package to Istanbul, and then becomes known by this Russian mafia as a spy, as the Condor Man. And he goes undercover and infiltrates the whole thing and, tries to save Barbara Carrera and defect her from Russia. That's a spy story. I mean, yes, he has, plastic wings strapped to him.
Yeah.
And I mean, also the movie is thoroughly spoofing the James Bond franchise, particularly the Roger Moore era. Yeah. And so it really takes it all right back to a spy film. It's one that I think I added that one to the list because I was aware of it as, from being a kid. I didn't see it as a kid, but it was one that I remembered. And as soon as we watched it, because sometimes when we put movies on the list that we haven't seen, we kind of apprehensively watch the movie and are like, oh God, did I make the right choice in suggesting this for an episode? But Condor Man was one where almost immediately I was like, nope, this was 100% a good call on my part.
And another one to just chip in, not to sort of signal what we're doing in the immediate future, but it's definitely on our list. We had Star Wars Rogue One suggested to us.
Yeah.
Which wouldn't seem like a spy film. If you just look at it, it's a Star Wars film. But I went back and watched it, and there's a whole spy plot throughout the film.
Well, the whole film is actually about them doing what would be a spy mission. If it was in the modern world, it would be a spy's mission to go in there and retrieve data and get out the data.
Exactly, and that character, I can't remember the name, Cam, I'm blanking on the main male character.
Oh, Cassian Andor?
Cassian Andor. He works for the Rebellion Intelligence Service.
Yep, so he is actually a spy for the Rebel Alliance.
Exactly.
Yep.
And there are a lot of popular franchises which dabble in that. I mean, the Marvel franchise, you've got the second Captain America movie, and you've got Black Widow coming up. In the Cars franchise, Cars 2 is a total spy spoof. And so a lot of other franchises that aren't necessarily defined as a spy movie franchise will often dabble in the genre, which then open them up to us to examine. I was actually just the other day looking at a 1980s Godzilla movie that could apply for further consideration in the future. So there's a lot of opportunities to tackle tweaks on the spy formula in formats that people might not expect beyond the sort of the standard what they think of as a spy film.
And before I forget to mention it, with Barbara Carrera, you've got a woman who's been in 2 Spyhard films, then I would have thought, eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm a big defender of Never Say Never Again. I think it's a legit Bond film, but we'll get to that someday.
One day. So, what was your first experience of spy films, Scott?
It's an interesting question. I'm just trying to think of the answer. I think it's got to be Bond.
Okay.
In all honesty, I think it's got to be James Bond. I know I definitely saw GoldenEye when it was on video release, not on cinema release in the UK. And I definitely played the video game. But before that, I had definitely seen, Octopussy and A View to a Kill, and a couple of the Roger Moore ones as quite a young child. I hadn't seen any of the Sean Connery ones, but I had definitely seen some of the later Roger Moores. And remember just thinking they were fun romps, which they are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for me, it was probably when I was about 9 years old, 8 years old, somewhere in there. I remember my sister was on a soccer team, and so I spent a lot of weekends having to sit in the car or somewhere, reading my Nintendo Power magazine while my sister played soccer. And I remember it was a particularly cold day. It was something like the winter, fall, somewhere in there. And my parents said, okay, tonight we're going to order in pizza and watch a James Bond movie, which the only knowledge I had of what a James Bond was actually from reading Archie comics. They would often spoof the character and they called him James Denob. They would spell Bond backwards in Archie comics. And so I didn't really understand what that meant. And I remember we watched A View to a Kill, the final Roger Moore film, and my imagination was just completely captured. I remember actually in school that same year, shortly after I watched View to a Kill, we had to draw little portfolios to keep our schoolwork in. They basically handed us white cardboard and we had to draw on them. And I think I might still have mine somewhere, but I drew Roger Moore and Christopher Walken as Max Zorin on mine, and I had moments recreating View to a Kill. So it really did grab my attention, and that just really drove me to bug my parents mercilessly to rent every James Bond movie available at the video store.
Well, hopefully your drawing on that is better than my drawing on the show notes.
It wasn't great. It was not great. I think Roger Moore had an arm protruding from his stomach or something.
Well, Scott's head looks very strange on my show notes, don't you think? Yes.
You should see it in person.
When this is all over, we'll all meet in a pub and have a drink together and everything.
Well, Cam's planning a little trip to the UK, and when this is all buggered off,
Absolutely.
I hopefully get to push him down the stairs at the Royal Albert Hall sometime soon.
Oh, that's nice.
Little nod to the Ipcris file.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yes. Since you've mentioned James Bond, we might as well skip ahead to that and say, so which is your favourite Bond actor then, Cam?
This is one of those questions that's so difficult for me because if you ask me intellectually, I think the best Bond actor is Sean Connery in his first 3 films. I mean, he is defining that role, and we are still always trying to evoke that. Even when they're looking at Daniel Craig, you so often hear people say, well, he's conjuring up the danger of early Connery. You can't escape what Connery did. But if you ask me my favorite, I mean, it's very hard for me to escape the shadow of Roger Moore. That's what made me love the franchise, was being a kid. And while View to a Kill was my first, it wasn't my favorite of the Roger Moores growing up. My favorites were like Octopussy and The Spy Who Loved Me. I was absolutely obsessed with both of those. Also, For Your Eyes Only. And so to me, there's something about the comedic value and just the big action sequences of the Roger Moores that I'm so nostalgic for. It's hard for me to say it's not my favorite.
Yeah, For Your Eyes Only, I was talking to somebody recently. We were talking about On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And I was saying to this person that I think On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a better film than it was initially thought to be, personally, because number one, it's probably the closest, or one of the closest to the books, essentially. And number two, they were trying to do something different with the franchise, which, you know, all respect to them for doing that, but because people wanted, by this point, it was almost, you knew what a Bond film was. It already had the elements set therein. So trying to do something else with it, like the romance and everything, and them getting married, I think people weren't wanting that. So then automatically it's almost like they decided straight after that with Diamonds Are Forever to almost basically just rehash what people expected from a Bond film. And then they did the same, I think, with For Your Eyes Only. Had really, it had less of the gimmickry. I mean, it had some of it, but not to the same degree. And it was a more closer to the classic spy film genre. But people put that film down a bit when it came out, which meant that automatically you went back to the same old routine with Octopussy. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the Bond franchise has always been very reactive to their films, and they often kind of go a little extravagant. You know, I mean, I think On Her Majesty's Secret Service is one of the best of the franchise, but it's also a little ahead of its time. Yeah. I think it was asking a lot for an audience at that point. Plus, you just have the whole replacing Sean Connery, which at that point was so unthinkable. So I think it had a lot of strikes against it. It's just one of those movies that took its time. You know, it's like It's a Wonderful Life. Was a bomb when it came out, and then it's years later that people recognized it for the great film it is, and you know it gets its place at last. I mean, when you have real artistry like you have in On Her Majesty's, it's going to get recognized at some point. It just wasn't 1968 or 69. So that does make sense. But yeah, when you look at the history of the franchise, I mean, you mentioned For Your Eyes Only. That's a reaction to Moonraker. After Moonraker, they're like, well, we've gone as far as we can go into Crazy Town. We've got to pull back and do For Your Eyes Only. They did the same thing again when you had Die Another Day, which also was Looney Tunes. And they go, okay, let's do Casino Royale. So it always feels like Bond kind of wanders into really, you know, wacky territory, and then they immediately pull back and go in the opposite direction, which I think it could be probably a little frustrating for people that are following movie to movie, but it makes the franchise a lot more interesting in terms of the broader picture, as well as probably has led to the longevity of it.
The thing is, though, with Casino Royale, when that came out with Daniel Craig, finally they got into a position where the audience were open to a film that was a bit more serious, shall we say, than the fare that you'd had from Pierce Brosnan and a lot of the Roger Moore stuff. So I think in a way the audience was at the right place for a more serious, shall we say, Bond.
I would agree with that. I would say Die Another Day, not that we've got to it yet, but was probably quite or very much responsible for that, because you look at how GoldenEye progressed into Tomorrow Never Dies. GoldenEye is quite serious. Tomorrow Never Dies leans on the camp and the jokes quite a lot. And then they seem to try and course correct again with The World Is Not Enough. And then again, they try and course correct back to comedy with Die Another Day. And plus, it's like the 90s. People are starting to want more of that sort of serious storytelling. And so you can see why they went, actually, let's sort of semi-reboot it. Let's go back to the source material, figure out what Bond is. And that's how you get Casino Royale.
And also, the Bond producers are very observant of pop culture trends. You had the Bourne films were getting very popular. You also had Batman Begins in 2005, which it wasn't a mega smash at the box office, but there was a lot of influence from the Batman Begins film going forward. And, you look at what Bourne was, you look at what the Casino Royale was. I believe it was actually even pitched as Bond Begins. they were very much looking at what these trends were for going back to the beginning, doing these more stripped down, action-based, realistic versions of heroes. And I think, it made sense. It made sense to follow that trend.
Yep, and I think it worked perfectly that they had an actor in the with the caliber of Daniel Craig to portray that character as well.
Yeah, the bummer is, Timothy Dalton's an actor who people don't. He's definitely getting more of his kudos lately, but his time really wasn't the 80s. People didn't really want what he was selling in the 80s, and I think Daniel Craig is able to benefit in a way that Dalton wasn't. I think if Dalton had come out in the 2000s, he could have been our, Daniel Craig, but he had to kind of pave the way to get to a Daniel Craig.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that both of Timothy's films are incredibly overlooked. I thought they were really good films, both of them.
They are, and they are very much getting a resurgence. I think a lot of people now are looking at them in parallel with what Daniel Craig has achieved with that franchise. It seemed like the franchise really moved away from Fleming when you got to the Moore era. And so often, especially nowadays with things like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, there's a lot more of a focus from the fans of being like, hey, keep this close to the novels, keep these close to the books. We want that spirit on the screen. Whereas I feel like a lot of the film-going public really just got on board with the Roger Moore mode of James Bond stories and said, hey, we like this, stick to this. And that is not what Dalton was delivering at all. He was going closer to Fleming, but at that point, I don't even know if audiences cared anymore.
No, and there again, you had another one with the License to Kill, which was another change from the usual Bond fare as well, where it's almost like it's a revenge story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Cam and I just took part in Mark O'Connor, who's a writer, written a Bond book.
Yeah.
He'd done a top 5 Bond list where everyone sort of writes down their favourite Bond films. And it was interesting that both me and Cam wrote down License to Kill in our top 5.
Wow, that's brilliant. That's great. So when you're getting ready for each episode, then what sort of research do you do? Is it a case of watching the film, or do you really do serious deep dives online and find out all that you can, the nitty-gritty behind production and everything?
It's different for me and for Cam. We both have our own approaches, and I think it kind of shows in the product itself. I tend to, because as we said at the beginning, Cam spent years doing podcasts, and he writes blogs on films. He's been writing about films for a very long time. I'm more of a popcorn eating, check my phone whilst at the cinema idiot. I just like my films. I'll go and watch them, but I'm not the guy who sits there analyzing them for hours on end afterwards. So in terms of preparation, all I actually do is I watch the films twice, and I write some notes about my thoughts on the film directly afterwards.
And I'm curious, Scott, what was the most punishing one to watch twice? There's been a couple.
There's been a couple. The one I struggled with the most was Men in Black 2.
Yeah.
It's a film that's completely void of any charm, of any wit, of any pace. It just feels like 19 minutes of just shrug. What about you, buddy?
So for what I do in terms of my process, I will put together kind of a little bit of a dossier on the movie that will I'll go in and dig up all the box office information on the film. That can be quite difficult when you're dealing with things made pre about 1975, but usually I'm able to find some results in some way, shape, or form. I will also do a sort of a abbreviated summary of the production of the film. Sometimes that's easy. Sometimes that's difficult. When you look at some, especially franchises are so easy. If I need to know the background on a James Bond movie, oh my God, it's so easy. There's so many different sources of information. It's all laid out for me. Love it. And then there's some things that are very difficult. Like, I'm thinking of like when we did like Cloak and Dagger, which is a 1980s family movie starring Henry Thomas. That one, I really had to dig around the internet to find interviews and piece things together in terms of any sort of behind the scenes on that movie, because it was kind of a it's a cult classic kind of now, but at the time totally ignored, and not a lot of written material on Cloak and Dagger going forward. So I always try to put together a dossier. Sometimes it's super easy, sometimes it's very difficult, but by and large, I'm usually happy with what I'm able to find when we record the episode. And I don't watch the movies twice like Scott. I tend to watch them just the once the night before we record, because we generally record in the mornings.
So how did you find that Cloak and Dagger then? Was that an easy film to find?
The film itself?
Yeah.
No, I think it was easy. I think that one was just one that we, at least I was able to just rent on probably, I don't know, Apple Rentals or something.
I think I rented it too, but a lot of the times I will just go on eBay and buy like a secondhand DVD, or I'll use something like CEX, which I'm sure is a company you're familiar with, Marv. Like a secondhand shop you can get stuff from, and they'll just send them to your house, and you can get them for like £3 most of the time. It doesn't cost too much. And I will just say as well, on our episodes, part of our research is in the episode itself. So before we get into how we think about or what we feel about the film, we do like a little briefing section where Cam will tell me the information he's learnt. And this is genuinely the first time I'm hearing it. So he'll tell me the box office, and this is me figuring it out. And that's sort of my reactions to it. So most of the time I'm just dumbfounded.
You see, I really love finding out historical context for all movies, not just the ones we cover on the podcast. I will watch a movie on a night off and immediately be online looking up the historical information on how that movie came to be. So that's just me kind of exercising all my kind of all the things that I love about film.
That's great. So are there any hidden gems that people don't know about that you think that they should know about?
Oh boy. Scott, does anything jump to mind to you of things we've covered so far that people should really check out that may not have, stumbled across those movies?
The one that jumps to mind, we discussed this on our sort of New Year's wrap-up episode, sort of at the end of 2020, was Hannah with Saoirse Ronan and Eric Bana. I didn't know anything about that film going into it, and I was just blown away by it. I thought it was such a great film.
Yeah, it was one that I saw right when it hit video back in the day. And no, actually, I saw it in theaters. That's right. Yeah, I went to see it in a very empty theater. And I remember walking out just thinking, like, why is no one talking about this movie? This movie is doing really interesting things with the genre. It has an incredible amount of style, an amazing score. Why is this movie kind of getting somewhat middling reviews and just being completely ignored?
And I've also got a soft spot for, I don't know if you guys have heard of this film. It's From Russia with Love.
Oh, yeah, that little film. Yep.
Yeah, that old chestnut.
Yeah.
No, the only other one that springs to mind would be, it didn't make the knock list, but I did actually not mind Men in Black 3 too much.
Yeah,
I thought it was quite quirky.
We also both enjoyed Where Eagles Dare, which it was actually a very popular episode for us, and it's one of those men on a mission World War II films that I was aware of. I don't know, though. A lot of people of my generation and younger are at all familiar with that movie anymore, and I think it's one they would enjoy. Another one, speaking for my side of the pond here, over in Canada, or I'll just say North America in general, The Ipcris File is not a particularly well-known movie at all. The Harry Palmer films are somewhat obscure over here. And so when I picked the Harry Palmer franchise for us to start on, I didn't know what I was picking. I just thought, okay, I like Michael Caine a lot. I've seen a lot of his work. Let's do some Michael Caine spy movies. And I really loved The Ipcris File, the style of it, the sort of anti-Bond, method of spy storytelling. I think it's a very cool movie. The sequels were kind of diminishing returns for me, but the actual first film, The Ipcris File, I think anyone who loves spy movies should check out. Scott, though, that was a polarizing episode because I think Scott came down a little bit on the opposite. It was a fun discussion.
Yeah, the Ipcris File has been the weight I've had to bear, I think, so far on this podcast. And in terms of feedback, most people just tend to be surprised I reacted to it that way. It's interesting that I just didn't find the joy in the film. I don't think I hated it. I didn't find the love that a lot of spy enthusiasts have found.
I'm actually surprised by that. Were there any of the other Harry Palmer films that you preferred to it, or have you not seen any of the others yet?
We've actually covered all of the films, and I mean, a little spoiler for next week, but we're covering the 2 TV movies he did in the 90s next week.
Wow.
So we're really rounding off the Harry Palmer, I don't know, whatever 5-film series there is, 5-film series is. But I actually preferred Funeral in Berlin.
Okay, because at the moment I've only heard the first Harry Palmer related episode, I think, that you've done.
Yeah, they all follow. Oh, sorry. They all kind of flow every 8 episodes until basically next week. So you'll have the next one coming out quite soon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, actually, I'll go to a question that Louise has just given to me. What would you say is your favourite Bond villain?
Villain?
Okay. Are we including henchmen, or are we just looking at the primary big bads?
I don't know. I mean, you could go either way, really, because I quite like a lot of the henchmen. Yeah, in some ways.
I'm gonna stick with villains, I think, for my answer. It's really hard to go wrong with Goldfinger.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good call. I mean,
Yeah.
any villain, anyone that cheats at golf, I mean, come on.
Yeah, what a scumbag. And a lot of the Sean Connery villains are actually quite memorable to me.
Yeah.
Dr. No as well. Rosa Klebb from Russia with Love. They all kind of knock it out the park, really.
Yeah, I mean, then you're also looking at the classic Blofeld, and I come down more on the Donald Pleasance Blofeld versus the Telly Savalas or the Charles Gray. But again, it's another very iconic one. That's something I think actually the Moors struggled more with. Was they had some great henchmen, but they had very few iconic, great main villains. But I keep coming back to Dr. No. I don't know that I would have said Dr. No when I was younger, but he's a villain that every time I revisit that movie, I am more and more impressed with Joseph Wiseman's very cold, almost computer-like performance. The hands are a nice touch. He also just sets the template for everything we're going to see going forward in that franchise. I think there's very few modern Bond villains that I would put on that sort of tier, really. I would say you can look at Le Chiffre in Casino Royale, Silva in Skyfall, and maybe 006 in Goldeneye, but those are the 3 best of the modern era, I think. But for me, there's something about Dr. No. There's a mystique to that character because he only has, I don't know, he's only in the movie for about 40 minutes or something like that, that he's a character that leaves you wanting more.
Nobody said Max Zorin yet, and that really annoys me.
But I love Max Zorin. I think Christopher Walken is having a blast. He's happiest in the saddle. But I don't know that I would say he's a top tier Bond villain.
He's the only one with a blimp, that's all I'm saying.
That's true. That is very true.
That is true. It's like the you remember Jaws, who is a henchman, more than you would the main villain in Spy Who Loved Me.
Yeah. Stromwell, yeah.
That's it, Stromwell, yeah. But you remember Jaws more than obviously I do.
Yeah, I know that they've said too that Stromwell was originally probably going to be Blofeld, and then there was so many legal issues that they ended up creating a new villain. Yeah, I think it would have been better if it was Blofeld.
So do I. But in a way, the Moonraker film, you've almost got the same thing there, where Stromwell, but it's a different named character, but the character in Moonraker is almost exactly the same as the character in Spy Who Loved Me, shall we say.
It's not just the villains, it's the whole movie is pretty much the same.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was one thing, Lewis Gilbert, who directed You Only Live Twice, would go on to do 2 more. He did Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker. And both of those movies are basically remakes of You Only Live Twice. Not a lot of versatility in his films.
No, Absolutely not. What would you name yourself if you were a spy character in a film, Scott?
I think I've either posed this question before or we've been asked this question on somewhere else before. So I'm going to keep my answer because it is a pseudonym I have used before.
Okay.
Although I suppose I'm giving up my identity by saying it on a podcast, but hey, I'm not actually a spy. So my secret identity is Gary Jones.
Nice.
It's so, beige. You wouldn't suspect a Gary Jones. You would just stamp that passport and he would walk right through that gate.
That's a good call. It makes me think of Gary Mitchell, though, from Star Trek. Every time I hear Gary Jones, I think Gary Mitchell.
I'm looking at you awkwardly right now, Cam.
For me, I think I have to go with a name that I've used in the past. I used to work in community TV, and back in those days, you had often very, skeleton crews running TV shows. And so we would do like 4 or 5 jobs on one show. And we like to use fake names in the credits because it makes it look like you actually have a full crew and you're not a bargain basement production. And so I would use the name Trent Mason for my TV name. I used it for several years, and I think I would probably stick to that one. I think Trent Mason is actually a pretty good, flashy spy name.
That's great. My other half just asked me what I would name myself, but I think since my surname's Quibell and I'm very often called Q by people, I think I'd just be Q and not be an agent.
Is that kind of like Prince? You're just a symbol Q.
That's it. I'll just be the symbol Q.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. What's your favourite Bond gadget, by the way, Scott?
I think it has to be the flamethrower bagpipes. It's really hard to touch that. I'm half Scottish, so I could put a kilt on and you wouldn't think I was carrying a flamethrower. And look, I'm carrying a flamethrower.
that reminds me of that joke, the one they've invented for the Americans called a ghetto blaster.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, dear. What's your favourite gadget, Cam?
I think if I'm going to give a less jokey answer, I don't know that you can top the Lotus from The Spy Who Loved Me. I know a lot of people will say the Aston Martin because it had all the awesome gadgets in Goldfinger and Thunderball. But there's something about the Lotus that captured my imagination as a kid. I loved any movie, really, that involved water and sharks. And that movie has both. And we have a car that turns into a submarine and goes underwater where there are sharks. I mean, that is the ultimate gadget in my mind.
I think I had that as a toy, that the Lotus, where it changed, and I think you press a button on the side or something, and something happens. And I had the toy Aston Martin as well, where you press the button and the thing pops up at the back, the shield, I think it is.
Oh yeah. I've got the Eagle Moss little diorama of the Lotus underwater.
I think I would join you in a submersible, but I would take the crocodile.
Oh, that's a good call too. The crocodile from Octopussy is incredible.
That's brilliant. That's so good. So, when you're editing your show, how do you put the show together, and how do you record it?
I scream into a microphone for about 2 hours, and then Cam has to spend 5 hours cleaning it up, I'd say.
Well done, Cam.
Yeah. We record using Zencaster,
Okay.
which we found to be a pretty good way of recording podcasts remotely. And since Scott lives in London and I live in Vancouver, remotely is our only option. But when it comes to editing, I do all my editing in Sony Acid, which is a audio program I purchased years ago. I found it to be one of the best for assembling these things. With some of my other podcasts, I will use Audacity. Audacity is pretty good. I use it for cleaning up audio generally, but I find in terms of actually assembling episodes, I go through and do most of my edits in Sony Acid and then put it all together in there and then go from posting it right from there.
So the show music and any clips that you use, how do you go about that, and where did you get the show music from?
Oh, that's, I guess, a little bit of my brainchild. Years ago, I used to put together rap music with my friend.
Okay.
Those songs will not see the light of day. They're humiliating. But it kind of taught me the basics of how to assemble music using loops and whatever. And so over the years, I've done a lot of that sort of stuff. And so I think, every podcast I do, I'll put together theme music. And the Spyhards music, I just sat down and I was like, okay, I always start with a visual. And I just knew I wanted something that represented 60s spy films. And so I just sit there until I figure out music that makes me think of 60s spy films.
Cool. So, what's your take on using clips? I don't think you use clips, do you, from films? Or I can't remember now.
We don't. No, we don't use anything that's sort of proprietary stuff that's owned by other companies. We're trying to stay away from sort of copyright and that sort of stuff. We do use clips of our own episodes that I will produce using the Headliner app on my phone. Yeah. But yeah, we don't use any actual snippets from movies or anything like that.
But if you're doing something like that, then when you come to a film that Cam's already done on his previous show, couldn't you actually take a clip from that previous show and say, here's one I did earlier, or something along those lines?
We could, but I don't know that I need to dredge up like 12-year-old clips of myself talking in, I'm sure, very compromised audio about whatever movie it is.
What are you talking about? You listen to yourself all the time.
Oh, obviously, yeah. I mean, the old show the first one I ever did, I'm sure the audio is pretty rough by comparison. And it's something that when I listen to other people's podcasts, I don't obsess over, but I very much obsess over the audio quality of our show. And so the idea of throwing in audio that I don't like very much would just drive me crazy.
Okay, now it is an interesting one. I don't know whether you noticed this on the show notes that I put we could play a bit of a game and see if between you could create a whole new James Bond film story.
Okay.
So what elements do you think that it needs to be a perfect Bond film?
I mean, Bond very much works through a template, right? So you're really, everything's kind of established already. You're going to have the mission you're going to go on. You're going to have the female leads who pop up. You're going to have your central villain. There's probably a henchman. There's probably a battle at the end. So you're kind of looking at those elements as well as gadgets along the way. And so, of course, you want your really cool sounding title and, your theme song.
Do you think that sets James Bond apart from things like, should we say, Harry Palmer and George Smiley?
In terms of having a template?
Yeah, because they can be a bit more, should we say, surprising, but they're also very laid back as compared to the Bond films, because there's very few films that go quite as extravagant as Bond, shall we say?
Right. I mean, I would say the Harry Palmer films follow a template for sure. Would you agree with that, Scott?
The Palmer films?
Yeah, the Harry Palmer ones.
I think I think they try to stick to it, but it seems to get looser and looser as it goes along.
But they do have a general template, I would say. And
the first three definitely do.
Yeah, and so I think it's really just they're going for something completely different artistically, and a lot of that can come to pace. Scott and I, one of our, I think, fun conversations was talking about like the villain of the Ipcris file. In a Bond film, they live it, inside a hollowed out volcano or under the sea or something crazy. And in the Ipcris file, the villain is like sitting in the local library doing research. Like, it's just kind of like the choices you make artistically will affect what the overall package is. And Bond aims for they are superhero movies in some ways. The early Bond character may not be the superhero that he is in like the Roger Moore films, but the world he lives in is kind of a comic book world.
So if you were making the follow-up Bond film to No Time to Die, what do you think would be a really good story for that?
It is a tough question because it kind of goes down to personal taste. Because me and Cam both look for different things in Bond films, I would say. But I think if we were going to try and go for something that would be a box office smash, so maybe not necessarily what we both like, but we just try and draw on what the the mass consensus would be. I think you just have to tell another origin story.
Oh, you see, that's not where I go at all. Yeah, I don't want an origin story at all. I think we've kind of nailed that with Casino Royale. I go, there's nowhere to go from there. I have more the attitude of like, honestly, what I would do is I would have the movie set in the 60s. I would do a period piece that removes all these issues that you have introduced over the years with cell phones and technology, trackers in Bond's bloodstream. Like, we can go back to more of those vintage gadgets and ideas like that, and villains that are a little more, less real world than some of the ones of late, like Dominic Green.
See, I'll jump in back on that, Cam. That is basically what I was pitching, because if you, in a sense, I say it as a reboot, but that's because in an origin story, anything going back to the 60s would have to explain who Bond is again.
The audience knows, though. I think that's the problem that we run into, like where you had like the Spider-Man movies where they rebooted them and then they're like, well, we got to tell this story again. And audiences were like, we know, we get it. It's kind of like, how many times do you have to show that Superman came from Krypton?
That's true. So you would just have, I mean, I agree with you on the 60s. I think it needs to go back to a slightly less intense time and have some more of the fun that the books do have, and some of the earlier Bond films do too. But so you would just have him turn up on the screen and be like, Bond, James Bond, shaken not stirred.
Yeah, more or less. I think you can have references or acknowledgement of the fact that maybe he's a younger agent and early in his training, but I don't think you need to go through the recruitment from the naval service or anything like that.
I think in a way you've already been introduced to the 60s Bond if you've watched the Connery films, really.
Mm-hmm.
I do agree. I just think that heading down the path we're heading now, you look at the progression from Casino Royale to now, it just seems to be getting not darker and darker, but just the stakes keep getting higher and higher. And I don't know whether Bond becomes more of a superhero at this point. Whereas you think about the Sean Connery era, especially the first few films, he does just feel like sort of an extravagant agent. He isn't necessarily saving the entire universe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially in those first couple. Like, it's pretty low stakes missions in Dr. No and From Russia with Love.
But at the same time, I would actually say that From Russia with Love is one of my favourites, personally.
Yeah, I think I put it down as maybe second or third on my top 5.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the really great adaptations of the book. The book is actually very similar, except the book doesn't introduce Bond until halfway through. The first half is all about setting up the villain plot, and then we get to watch Bond then stumble into this villain plot in the second half of the book. And I think the movie does a fantastic job of merging the book elements together, and it feels in some ways like I tend to come down a little more on Dr. No being my preferred one. A lot of that has to do with the location, the villain, various elements like that. But it's hard to argue that From Russia with Love isn't the most almost confident and well-refined of the Connery Bonds.
I think they'd taken what they got from the Dr. No, and they just went that little bit further.
Yeah, and I love that they play the Bond theme over scenes where he walks through hallways.
So do I. I like, but then I like when characters have their themes that follow them around, shall we say, in films anyway.
Oh yeah.
I mean, just to spin off from the question, I don't know, Marv, if you had this lined up next, but if we're talking about creating a Bond reboot, who would you cast as Bond? I'll throw it out to you both.
It's one of those questions I find so difficult because I think I've said this on our show, but if you had asked me, in 2005, would you give the job to Daniel Craig? I would have said, no, I don't know who that guy really is. And I would have been dead wrong. I never would have seen what was coming. And I think that's kind of what I like with these casting decisions is that usually when people think outside the box, you get these great casting choices. I wouldn't have pushed Heath Ledger as the Joker in The Dark Knight or Christian Bale as Batman for that matter. But it was those casting choices that were a little outside the box that gave me things far richer than anything I could have come up with. I think casting is actually a very difficult job. And a lot of people like myself have very narrow imaginations, and they go, well, who matches the hair color? That sort of thing.
Something that all three of us love, going to that, I mean, on the same subject, is something like Star Trek, where they'll have a new series start and they'll put people into roles, and you'll think, wow, I never expected those people to be in Star Trek. Like, once it found its footing in the later seasons, Enterprise, for instance, Scott Bakula, you would never expect him to be in a Star Trek film, series.
Yeah, and I remember when they cast Carl Urban as Bones. I don't know if people remember this, but Star Trek fans were not happy. He was kind of the buff guy from Lord of the Rings and Pathfinder and some other action movies like that. And it was like, this is absolutely ridiculous. This is not DeForest Kelley. And then he shows up and he's almost more DeForest Kelley than DeForest Kelley. And he's become like probably the biggest fan favorite out of that whole cast.
Absolutely. Closely followed by, I think that in the first film, Zachary Quinto did a fabulous job with Spock.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think he's the next solid hit out of that cast. The one I think was a dud, and I'll stick to this, is Simon Pegg. And I love Simon Pegg, but I think Scotty is just... I think he just tries to pretend to be Scotty.
He feels like the most caricature of the group.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I love Zoe Saldana. I think she is astonishing as Uhura and has inhabited or imbued that character with so much that was just never provided for that character in the original series. I think she is a real standout as well.
Absolutely. Just, kudos to them for having James Doohan's son actually in the Star Trek films as well as an engineer.
One of the greats.
He's always nice at the conventions, Chris Doohan.
Yep. Yeah, he tells some good stories for sure.
He does. So, going to... here's an interesting one that I've got down. I don't know how I came to this as a question, but the George Smiley character. Who's your favourite George Smiley? Is it Alec Guinness or Gary Oldman?
I'll say I'm somewhat of a novice in the world of Le Carré. So I've seen The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. I've seen Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Not a lot beyond that. Scott and I have planned out at least one movie in the fairly near future. But my only real access point is Gary Oldman. And it's hard for me to decide on anyone other than Gary Oldman at anything. I think Gary Oldman's an astonishing actor. So I'll go with him because he's the safe choice for me.
And it's fairly safe to assume if we haven't covered the film, I probably haven't read the book. So I know Le Carré in terms of books, and I definitely don't have any of his films apart from the Harry Palmer, though he's not called that in the books. Films in my head. You just look at we interviewed, actually speaking of Star Trek connections, we interviewed Nicholas Meyer some time ago because he was quite heavily connected with Tomorrow Never Dies.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'll save the episode not to spoil it for you and sort of his connections. But we later in the episode, he starts asking us about our sort of what we've read in terms of spy novels, and we were both put to shame by Nicholas Meyer. So don't expect us to be very well educated on that side of things, especially not me.
Yeah, well, there's a great podcast out there called Spybrary that tackles spy literature. That's where you want to go for spy literature. We're the film guys. I've read a significant amount of the Ian Fleming James Bond novels, but I'm not a big spy literature reader. I'm not a big fiction reader in general. I tend to read more film biographies and things like that. So
I'm about to show that I don't know much about the books that either. So Harry Palmer then. So he's not Harry Palmer in the books.
No, he's actually an unnamed character in the novels, which was kind of one of those little things I discovered while we always on our Instagram account at Spyhards, we try to put up trivia throughout the week based around the movie we've tackled that week. And that was just a little factoid I came across when we were promoting Ipcris File. And I was kind of like, that's really interesting. And it's something that I'm sure any fan of Len Dayton was like, well, duh. But for me, it was like, oh, that's really interesting that they built this whole franchise around a character named Harry Palmer, who was not named Harry Palmer in the novels.
Wow. So, what would you say are tropes that you have to have in all spy films or most spy films?
It gets tough when we're tackling Men in Black here.
Yes, it does.
I would say generally there's like a covert organization at the core. Probably some sort of like basic mission concept. Not necessarily, though. I'm thinking of stuff we've got coming up that isn't necessarily a mission. But there has to be something to do with like an espionage element being brought into sort of a world of intrigue that I think is very crucial.
We looked at there's an episode called The Briefing, which is the first episode we put out, where we kind of set out our mission statement. And one of the things we sort of mentioned is what is a spy film? And it's a very hard, I mean, you can look up the definition of the word spy and you could use that as a literal thing. But I think if anything is covered in terms of, as Cam says, like a covert agency or some sort of a mission or someone going undercover, anything like that, if it brushes against it, then we will look at it. So if any of those tropes are covered, I'd say as long as one of them is in the film, it will count for us. Even Spy Kids 4.
Ooh. Are you doing all 4 of them?
Yes, sir.
Yep. We are committed. I mean, I don't even think that's the worst thing we've got, buried for later. We also have the Cats and Dogs franchise. There's all sorts of crazy stuff out there.
Wow. If you could, what spy gadget would you invent?
You know what? I've always dug, I mean, the Bond franchise goes to this well, but I've always loved the the grappling cord that comes out of a watch, the grappling cable.
Yeah.
I think anything like that would be so awesome. It just takes me back to, I was a huge fan of the 1989 Tim Burton Batman, and he had that awesome rappel cord he would shoot out of the little hand gadget thing. If I could do that off a watch, I could die happy.
I'd say, well, if we're counting Men in Black films as spy films, I'm going to invent the neuralizer, just so I can remove Men in Black 2 from my memory, and maybe several nights out in my life, probably get rid of those too. But yeah, I think the neuralizer would be a very good gadget to have to hand. Oh, I didn't get my lunch today. Give it to me now. Oh, I need another lunch. Oh, my pizza never turned up.
You haven't given me my paycheck this week, boss.
Yeah. Oh, and I quit. I'm now a millionaire. Yeah, something like that. The neuralizer would do me, I think.
You're right. That's the perfect gadget, because then you could use it on somebody. You could say when you were a kid, you could go, "I've had my dinner. Can I have my pudding now? I have had my dinner. You might have forgotten it."
Yeah, you can throw your vegetables in the bin and then neuralize your mum. Be like, "I ate them all.
I ate them all. Can I have my apple pie now?
Yeah.
Can I have the ice cream?"
You could take that out on Halloween night and go to the same house over and over again. It would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just keep going and go, "Trick or treat. Have I seen you before?" Beep. No, you've not seen us before. Oh, we'll give you those sweets again now.
Just don't forget your sunglasses too, otherwise you might mess up a few things.
Absolutely. So, what other podcast do you listen to, Cam?
I listen to a number. I listened to the Slash Filmcast I referenced up front. I still have listened to that one for, God, what is that, like 13 years now or something? I find that show is very well put together. It's a film pop culture, so they do a lot of TV, mostly film-centric, though. I listen to The Franchise, which goes through franchises one after another. It's a little rougher around the edges than Spyhards, but I find the hosts have a really good dynamic going. I'm also a big Survivor fan, so I listen to a lot of Survivor podcasts. There's a show called Rob Has a Podcast where he interviews survivors and does Survivor coverage. That is a weekly listen for me. So my tastes are very eclectic. They kind of bounce all over the place, but those are 3 that jump to mind.
I'm guessing that Scott is also eclectic with his listening.
It's actually quite strange because before the coronavirus came along, I would say I listened to two, three, maybe four podcasts a day.
Yep.
I did a lot of exercise. I was exercising in the gym a lot. I did a lot of walking. I was out a lot, really. So I did digest a lot, and it's definitely gone down since being locked in. And but I'd say the ones I've definitely stuck onto would be I still listen to the Wade Keller pro wrestling podcast. I listen to Subspace Transmission. That's Cam's Star Trek podcast because they're friends of mine, and I don't mind Cam's voice. Otherwise, I wouldn't talk to him for 2 hours every week. Another couple of shout outs. There's actually some of your alumni from the show, Marv. So you've had Spotlight on.
Yeah.
They're friends of ours. They've been on our podcast recently, actually covering Men in Black International of all films. And they had a good old time taking the mickey out of that one. And another one I've been sort of getting into recently is another alumni of yours. I'm not sure the episode's out yet, but Adam and Craig's Guilty Pleasures.
Yep.
Me and Adam actually used to work together.
Okay.
We both used to work for Virgin Active, which is a gym company here in the UK. Actually, I think it's international, I should say. And we worked together for about 4 years, and we hadn't spoken, and we both ended up starting our own podcast. It's just quite interesting that we both did it around the same time.
Absolutely.
Small world.
It's a very small world, incredibly. To pull away the curtain a bit here, I'm actually chatting with Adam and Craig tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
Because I got a small bit of a chat with them when we did a group show together over Christmas about Christmas. Was it about? Yeah, we were talking about Christmas films. And pre-show, we got a few questions in while we waited for another person to join us. So tomorrow we're actually finishing off and getting the questions asked and all that tomorrow, basically to make a full episode out of.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because I saw them pop up on my Instagram. I think they started a few weeks after us, I think. Yeah. And it was just like, hey, that's Adam from work. What's he? Oh, he's doing a podcast. And you know, I hadn't worked with him for about 3 years at that point. And it's just quite interesting. We've both been led down the same path. We both do film podcasts, although his is more sort of overall film, whereas we're spy only. But yeah, I just think it's quite a lovely coincidence that.
Well, it'd be interesting if you could do a crossover, or you go onto their show and they come onto yours.
Oh, perhaps. It's in the works. It's in the works.
Because I'm sure there must be some guilty pleasure, shall we say, films that would fit into the spy genre.
I think he knows I'm a massive Star Trek fan as well. We used to talk about Star Trek and wrestling when we were working together quite a lot. So I think we're planning on potentially doing a Star Trek film down the road.
Okay, that's good. Hold on. Oh yes, Louise is saying, haha, Austin Powers. Yes, darling, they are going into the Austin Powers films as well.
Yeah, there's a few like Austin Powers, Mission Impossible. People keep asking us, when are those coming? When are those coming? It's like, they'll arrive at some point, but we have to balance out our, power hitter franchises here. We've got Bourne wrapping up pretty soon. We've got Bond, we've got some heavy hitters coming out of the gates, so we can't rush through all the greats right up front.
It's an interesting point of discussion, but we had someone message us today just asking us, because we just, as I say, Condor Man is our episode this week, which is, a Disney spy superhero film from 1981 that's sort of a cult following to it, but it isn't well known, say, like the James Bond films. And they asked us, in earnest, you guys started off with quite high-profile films. Why have you moved on to these sort of more lesser-known projects? And I sort of explained to the chaps that ultimately you can't just do the heavy hitters, because you'll just, as I think we said earlier in the episode, you'll just run out really quickly.
It's also just not as much fun. I mean, Scott, we've done some episodes on movies like Jumpin' Jack Flash, or, Condor Man's another good example, or Men in Black International with Spock. Those episodes were so much fun. And I think it, honestly, for me, it has less to do with the movie than the discussion. But sometimes when you're dealing with these, sacred gems of the genre, I mean, it kind of removes a little bit of the ambiguity of the conversation because you're like, well, clearly we have a masterpiece. Now let's talk about how it's a masterpiece for 2 hours.
And people do want to hear that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they, these episodes still get listened to afterwards. But, if you look in Apple Podcasts and you search Condor Man, there aren't many podcasts that have covered Condor Man.
Yep.
So instantaneously, if someone is looking that up, we'll be the first ones that pop to the front.
It's also impossible, I find, to predict what people want. Like, I think I could sit here and try to engineer the show that every listener is going to want to hear, and I would be wrong. Because there's been episodes, I cited Where Eagles Dare earlier, but, I mean, when I picked the Ipcris file, I didn't really think that those would be popular. And then the Harry Palmer episodes became very popular for this podcast. So, again, you can't really predict exactly what people want. So, who knows, right?
Yep, you just reminded me that I meant to come back to something. You mentioned Where Eagles Dare, so I'm guessing that you'll also be going into the Guns of Navarone and then the Force. What number is it? Force 10 or Force 9 from Navarone? Is it
Force 10? Yeah.
Force 10.
Possibly. I know I've got like Raid on Rommel on the list, which is another Richard Burton World War II film. I need to look closer at those Guns of Navarone to see if they really fit because. I've seen both of them.
Yep.
Thinking about it, I think there is, especially with the sequel, there is probably a little bit of merit there. So possibly, I would never rule it out if we can sit there and figure out an angle because we want to be able to explain to our listener why they belong. Because there's some people raise an eyebrow and go like, wait, why are you doing Men in Black or, whatever, other things in the future. But, we have another franchise we've just planned to start that we're going to have to give a little bit of background as to why we think it applies. So if I can make it work, yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah, because I remember you having a joke, weren't you, towards that every now and again you'll come up with something and you'll say, oh, we'll do a spin-off series of that and call it something Hards or something this or something.
Horse Hards coming to a podcast that near you.
That was the one. Films about horses, Horse Hards.
We've launched a few of those because we had Pirate Hards. There's been a few.
Pirate Hards, yep. Space Hards, yeah.
I'm surprised we haven't had Party Hards yet.
That's when we, pitch like Wayne's World.
Yep. Weekend at Bernie's.
Excellent.
Party on.
Someone got that reference, thank you.
Absolutely. So what advice would you give to people starting in podcasting for the first time?
Run.
Get Cam to do all the work.
Don't quit your job. I would say what I would do. I think my first recommendation would be a lot of people go, hey, I love talking about movies. I'm just going to talk about movies. And that's a big field you're dealing with. And I think you need an angle. We have a friend named Miles who runs the Disc Dump podcast. And it is a general film, music discussion podcast, but he has a hook in that he owns all these things on discs and he wants to clear up space. Which discs do I keep? And so it's a little bit of a knock list type thing. He'll talk about a subject, but then decide by the end of the episode, am I pitching this out or am I keeping it? And I think you want to have a hook like that. If you're going to go in, because there's so many podcasts, same thing we looked at. James Bond, the market is flooded. But there's not a lot of spy movie podcasts. I think you want to find a way to brand yourself that makes you seem very appealing to people who would enjoy the sorts of things you enjoy.
And I think the only thing I would really say is I would say do it for the love of doing it and the passion of wanting to talk about something you're passionate about.
Yeah.
Because it's such a crowded landscape now that I unless you're very, very, very lucky, you're not going to hit straight away.
Yeah.
You're not going to click. You're going to get a few listens on your first episode. So if you don't care about that and you're just doing it for the love, it's fantastic. But if you're expecting your first episode to get 400, 500 listens on day one, unless you're a celebrity, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and you're probably not going to get the Joe Rogan paycheck either. And that's actually another thing I'm glad you brought up, Scott, that you have to love doing it because it's a time investment. Scott, as he says, he sits and watches these movies twice. Well, that can be up to, 5 hours of his week, depending on how long the movie is. Could be even longer. Could be 6 hours if we do something that's 3 hours.
And I'll just jump in on that, Cam, but then you can jump back in. But and not to mention, Cam and I have a pretty good split in terms of what we do with this podcast. Cam is the editor in chief. He cuts everything together. He helps lay things out. He's the audio guy. He's my tech guru. But in terms of social media, day-to-day business, that's me. That's me on the keyboard, and I'm the one answering and tweets and retweeting stuff and DMing people and setting up guests and getting interviews most of the time. And so it is it's not a job. I do it voluntarily. I really enjoy it, but it is work.
Yep.
Yeah, bang on. And also, if you don't enjoy doing that work, if you don't enjoy the process, you're not going to run the show week to week. You're going to get tired and burnt out. And then or whatever your time schedule is, whether it's every 2 weeks or every week, you're not going to stick to the schedule. You're just going to be like, okay, forget it. And then it's kind of like it is a bit of a commitment, and you have to be able to say, am I going to be able to meet these deadlines? Am I enjoying this process? And I think you'll know before you start, really, because you'll sit down and go, wow, this is, quite a few hours going into editing my first episode. Huh. Every week, huh? If you don't enjoy it, you're not going to stick with it.
Absolutely. Anyway, where can people find your show and how can they get in touch with you?
We're very fortunate in this, in that sort of sense, because we are basically everywhere at Spyhards. That's SPYHARDS. So that's Facebook, that's Twitter, that's Instagram. We're even on TikTok. We're on YouTube. We're on basically every podcast app you can think of, from Acast to Spreaker, Apple, Google, Spotify. Just search for Spyhards, and that's where you'll find us.
Yep, Letterboxd as well. And also, that's another actually good tip for people starting out. Come up with a name for your podcast you can secure social media handles for, because that is also a great thing to have.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why you can find me anywhere at Pods Like Us.
Mm-hmm. We were genuinely shocked that Spyhards was free. So
yeah, absolutely. So I forgot to ask, where did the name Spyhards come from then?
When we decided on spy movies, we just thought about we both came up with a couple of titles each, and I think the two front runners were Spyhards, which we inevitably went with, and the other one, which I now use in our intro, which is For Your Ears Only.
Yep. Yep. We also, I remember kicking around Live and Let Spy. I think Scott, didn't we also pitch? I think you pitched Mission Impossible, and then that wound up being an actual real podcast that exists.
I think it came up in the conversation, but then the Impossible lads came along anyway, so it worked out really well. And they started basically the same week as us, so they're like our spy bros.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like, originally this show was going to be called Chatterpod. So it would have been a bit, other things might have come into it as well, but that was taken. And then Louise, my other half, actually came up with the name Pods Like Us, which is a pun on a possibly little-known Paul McCartney song, and also a comedy spy film, Spies Like Us.
Yeah,
of course, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that title wasn't taken, and I've realised that it's actually the perfect title for what the show's all about, really.
And you also got there's another podcast, Not Before Coffee, run by a good friend of the show, Ray, who was one of our first guests actually on our Mission Impossible 2 episode, which is a great podcast.
Men in Black 2.
Oh, sorry, Men in Black 2. We haven't done the Mission Impossibles. Thank you, Cam. And there was already a Not Before Coffee podcast.
Okay.
But there hadn't been a new episode for about 3 years. And so she wanted to have that as her title. And so she tried to message the owner and they never got back to her. So she waited until the domain defaulted and she could get most of the social medias, and eventually got all that sorted and then launched the podcast.
Wow.
She likes coffee.
Obviously, I can tell. Anyway, thank you both for talking with me.
Oh, no. Thank you very much for having us. This was fun.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
Marv. I
much.
appreciate you having us on.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us. I think Cam is the one who don't you also do a sci-fi show as well?
I do a Star Trek podcast as well, yes.
Yeah. You might have to be a returning guest, I think, Cam. Louise says that's what she looks like before she puts makeup on. No, you don't. Dear me.
I was waiting for you to jump in and defend it there. Exactly. That's the answer you're supposed to say.
That's right. Yep.
Of course you don't, darling.
Of course you don't. No.
Self-deprecation.
No. I'm looking forward to hearing what you both said about Condor Man.
No comment. I won't spoil it for anyone.
Right.
Scott's wearing the costume right now.
Brilliant. Well, at least you can find the costume easier than you can find the film.
Oh, it is atrocious in this country to find it.
It really is. It so is.
It should be on Disney Plus. I don't really understand why it's not.
I mean, it's Michael Crawford. He's like, a British, national treasure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We should.
We probably don't treat him as well on the podcast, but to be fair, my only experience of him is this film.
Right. Okay. Oh, right. Oh. So you've not watched anything with him in before, mind you? What's
not knowingly.
Been in?
Some others do have him.
Actually, that's all I can think of him from. And stage musicals, which I've never seen him in. So yeah.
Phantom of the Opera.
Yeah.
He's a good singer.
He was the original Phantom of the Opera. Yeah.
He was the original Phantom of the Opera. Yeah.
He's got a good voice as well.
They can hear you on the other end. That's all right. It's fine. Okay. Dear me. So, so are you from the UK then, Scott, and Cam's from Canada, is it?
Correct.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
So for Cam, it's around tea time then, is it? 5:10?
It's 2:00 here.
Oh, 8 hours behind.
He's a West Coaster.
Right, he's a West Coast. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in Vancouver.
Okay, so it's the same for the clocks as you go across the time zones as you go across Canada. It is,
yeah.
The US, right? Okay.
Yeah. We're it's basically the same as New York versus LA.
I need to remember what knock stands for was in the knock list, I think, or just get you to explain it perhaps at some point.
Sure,
That
we
might
can
be
explain
better.
it. It's
Yeah,
probably
that's
easier.
Yeah.
I still struggle. I get Cam to do it every time. It's fine.
Well, Cam sounds like he's a professional because he sounds like he's doing all sorts of podcasts.
I just like to annoy people on the regular.
As do I. Right, let's see how we go, shall we?
Okay.
How was that? Have we hit all the bases, or do you think there's anything that we need to touch on?
I think we got everything. I think, yeah. I don't think we missed out on anything.
I never am a big fan of talking about myself for too long. I could do a little bit. I could do a little bit quite easily, thanks. But yeah, I tend to be like, if you have questions, we'll answer them. But like, that's why I don't like bigging myself up on social media. But so if you think you've got everything, Marv, that's the important thing.
I think so. I don't know whether you noticed, Scott, that I posted up a tune. I came up with an instrumental piece of music earlier on that was based, because I was thinking about talking to you guys tonight, so I've come up with my own spy thriller instrumental theme tune.
I did see it. I saw it when I was out in my my gym, and I couldn't actually play it. So I'm going to actually listen to it after this. Funnily enough, it's on my list of things to do before bed.
And just in case Cam hasn't seen it, it's called The Spy Who Came In for a Coffee. So, yes.
So have you? Is that because I saw? Yeah, I can see it on here now. There's actually 2 posts. Oh no, one's music, one's not. Is that all you doing it through like electronically, or have you actually playing instruments on it?
I'm playing the guitars and keyboards and congas and maracas, and everything else is programmed on there.
It's like the opposite of our intro, basically. It's all digital.
Right.
I should do a bass line for us someday. I've got many guitars. I should use them for something. Yeah.
Which one was the Bond film where they had was it Die Another Day? They had a really good introduction to it with pre-credit, and then it was rubbish afterwards.
That's The World Is Not Enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's The World Is Not
Well, I
Enough.
don't know. It could be Die Another Day. I think it probably applies.
The one where he's captured.
Oh no, that's Die Another Day. That's Die Another Day.
Die Another Day.
Mm.
Really good pre-credit sequence.
And then he's got everyone's lockdown look at the end with the beard and the hair.
Yes, he has. Yeah. Lockdown over 20 years before it happened.
Yeah, exactly. I wish I still had my hair.
So do I. Wish I did.
I'm going to jet though because I think I'm probably going to go to bed unless we're going to go record this. So, Marv, thank you for having us on.
Thank you very much, and I've already added Cam's other show to my list of shows to check out.
Oh, thanks so much.
I'm a huge Trek fan.
I just, funnily enough, this joke won't land, I don't think, for Cam, but Marv, you'll get it. I was out walking the dog today, and I had a really good idea for a Star Trek rewatch show.
Okay.
So it's just TOS.
Yeah.
And so I called it Tossers. See,
yes, I get that.
The joke lands on British people, but it won't land anywhere else.
And not British Columbians.
That's true. That's true.
But that's why Joss Whedon could get away with British swear words in American television shows.
He got away with a lot of things, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah. Dear me.
So I don't think Cam's taken me up on my tossers pitch there. So
Blank stare.
I think I'm out of luck there. Just you got the Blaylock face on.
Brilliant.
Right, yeah, I'm going to jet then. Do you need? I mean, I didn't record backup audio for this, so I assume you didn't need anything. You're happy with Zoom.
I am happy with Zoom so long as it's got everything. Yeah.
I would recommend checking out Zencaster if you get a chance. I always rave about it to people. It's free.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we started off with Zoom, and I find Zencaster is greatly improved our audio quality.
Is there no time limit to Zencaster then for the free? No.
Nope.
Wow.
You get separate tracks, and it just felt a lot cleaner.
Yeah, I get separate tracks on this actually on Zoom.
I mean, Cam is the edit guy, so he probably knows why it's better than this. So I don't know. Yeah. I just always recommend it to people, and they don't pay me. So
no, I often get people to do their own tracks local on their own computers and then send them. But I forgot today to ask you to do that, but it should be okay.
It's probably fine. It's just we generally get people to do backups, but whatever will be will be. But I'm going to go to bed, so I'm going to jump off the call.
All right. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you, Cam. Thank you, Scott. Take care.
Okay.
Take it easy, buddy. Bye-bye.